To most of the world, Richard Nixon is the haunted face on a television screen in August 1974. A president talking about resignation in a trembling voice. The word Watergate stamped permanently across his legacy. He is the comeback artist who rose from a California grocery store to the Oval Office, and the only American president forced to leave that office in disgrace. But behind the tape recorders, subpoenas, and headlines stood a much smaller universe. A family of 4, with 2 daughters who had to live out their formative years in a home that was both a sanctuary and the epicenter of a constitutional earthquake. Richard and Pat Nixon married in 1940, and after years of struggle and near misses, eventually had 2 daughters. Patricia, known to the world as Tricia, born in 1946, and Julie, born in 1948. By the time the girls were in grade school, their father had already been a congressman, a senator, and vice president of the United States. Their childhood was spent in the crossfire between their parents' fierce privacy and their father's relentless hunger for political redemption. While other children learned family stories around the dinner table, Tricia and Julie learned them from campaign buses, motorcades, and foreign trips. They grew up in a house where the television news sometimes spoke their father's name in admiration and sometimes in contempt, where their mother tried to build normal routines while the world judged every expression on their parents' faces. When Nixon finally reached the presidency in 1969, his daughters were no longer children but young women, one newly married into the Eisenhower dynasty, the other on the cusp of a rose garden wedding that would become a televised symbol of the normal American family their father wanted the country to see. Then came Watergate. For the nation, it was a political scandal. For the Nixon daughters, it was siege warfare inside their own lives. They watched their father's enemies close in, watched allies peel away, watched their mother absorb humiliation with clenched dignity. One daughter stepped forward as his most visible defender, facing cameras and hostile questions with a composure that seemed decades older than her years. The other retreated further into the protective shell of privacy her parents had always tried to maintain. This is the story of Richard Nixon and his 2 daughters, Tricia Nixon Cox and Julie Nixon Eisenhower, who inherited not just a famous name, but the long shadow of a presidency that ended in catastrophe. One became the guardian of privacy and continuity, living a quiet life while remaining linked to her father's legacy. The other became his public advocate, a writer and guardian of memory, determined to show the world a man she believed was far more complex than his worst headlines. We will move from number 2 to number 1, tracing how each daughter carried, reshaped, and, in different ways, tried to redeem the Nixon legacy. Number 2. Tricia Nixon Cox. Number 2 is Tricia Nixon Cox, the elder daughter of Richard and Pat Nixon, born in 1946 into a life already shaped by ambition, discipline, and the quiet tension that followed her father everywhere. From her earliest years, Tricia learned to live behind walls, the emotional walls her parents erected to protect their private world, and the literal walls of political life that surrounded her childhood. While Julie was more outspoken and instinctively public-minded, Tricia moved through the world with a practiced reserve, a composure that became her shield against the scrutiny that only intensified as her father climbed the political ladder. As a child, she lived through campaign after campaign, learning early how to smile for cameras, how to stand still beside her mother during rallies, and how to decipher the unspoken moods of her father as he returned from the highs and lows of political combat. She spent her teenage years navigating the surreal rhythms of being a political daughter. State dinners, foreign trips, and the daily proximity to power combined with a private sense of being watched, measured, and interpreted. The turning point in Tricia's life came during her father's presidency. In 1971, she became the first presidential daughter to be married in the White House Rose Garden, an event broadcast to millions, a moment engineered to project stability, grace, and tradition at a time when America was boiling with conflict over Vietnam, social change, and political distrust. Her wedding to Edward Cox became one of the most iconic images of the Nixon years. A shimmering tableau of American idealism staged at the very center of power. Yet behind the glamour, Tricia remained the most private member of the Nixon family, a woman who endured public spectacle with polite distance, but refused to become part of the political theater. Then came Watergate. While her younger sister spoke out passionately in defense of their father, Tricia's reaction was more inward. She did not confront reporters or publish arguments. She stayed close to her mother, helping Pat Nixon face the avalanche of humiliation and heartbreak that consumed the final years of the presidency. Tricia watched as her father deteriorated under pressure, as the West Wing darkened with fear and paranoia, and as the life they had built collapsed under the weight of scandal. When Richard Nixon resigned in August 1974, Tricia stood with her family on the South Lawn, her expression a mixture of heartbreak and unwavering loyalty. In the decades after her father's fall, Tricia retreated intentionally from the public eye. She raised her son, Christopher, supported charitable and educational causes, and avoided the spotlight except on rare occasions tied to her father's memory. Her silence became its own statement, a refusal to let her family's wounds become public spectacle. While Julie debated, wrote, and defended, Tricia embodied a different legacy: quiet endurance, dignity, and the chosen privacy of a woman who had already seen more public scrutiny than anyone should bear. Tricia Nixon Cox's legacy is one of restraint. She represents the daughter who witnessed the storm from within, but refused to let it define her life. Through her, we see the human cost of political catastrophe. A daughter who chose preservation over performance, family over fame, and a life lived far from the cameras that had once captured her every step. Number 1. Julie Nixon Eisenhower. Number 1 is Julie Nixon Eisenhower, born in 1948, the second daughter of Richard and Pat Nixon, and the child who would become the most vocal, visible, and fiercely devoted defender of her father during the darkest years of his presidency. If Tricia represented reserve, Julie represented resolve. From a young age, she possessed an instinct for engagement, a sharpened curiosity, and a confidence that placed her naturally in the center of events rather than at the edges. Julie grew up attuned to the emotional undercurrents of her family. She sensed her father's insecurities as deeply as she sensed his ambitions. She watched his long political exile after losing the 1960 presidential race and the 1962 California governorship. And she felt the electric shift in her home when he rose again to claim the White House in 1968. While Tricia maintained a formal distance from politics, Julie stepped into it, learning the mechanics of campaigns, public messaging, and press relations with the same determination her father brought to debate preparation. The turning point in Julie's life came with her marriage in 1968 to David Eisenhower, grandson of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a union that merged two of the most significant political families of the 20th century. Their marriage was symbolic, historic, and deeply scrutinized. Yet beyond the symbolism, Julie embraced her new role with maturity far beyond her years, becoming a poised public figure at a moment when the Nixon administration desperately needed stability. But her defining chapter arrived when Watergate exploded. As scandal engulfed the presidency and her father's political survival hung in the balance, Julie became his staunchest public defender. She appeared frequently on national television, confronted skeptical reporters, and articulated arguments presidents and senior advisors struggled to express. She spoke not as a political operative, but as a daughter convinced of her father's fundamental decency. Her voice carried both conviction and raw emotion, the unmistakable tone of someone fighting for the man, not the office. During the agonizing months leading to resignation, Julie shouldered burdens no daughter should bear. She served as intermediary between her parents, helped shield her mother from the cruelty of headlines, and encouraged her father when his confidence faltered. When Nixon resigned in 1974, Julie's devastation was visible, but so was her resolve. In the years that followed, she became an unofficial historian of her father's life, co-authoring books, granting interviews, and working tirelessly to present a fuller picture of the man behind the scandal. As an adult, Julie continued her advocacy through writing, philanthropy, and leadership roles in cultural and historical institutions. She balanced loyalty with intellect, acknowledging her father's failings without allowing them to erase his accomplishments or humanity. Her steady presence at the Nixon Library, at academic debates, and at national commemorations positioned her as the enduring voice of the Nixon legacy. Julie Nixon Eisenhower's legacy is one of loyalty, articulation, and unbroken determination. She is the daughter who defended her father when the entire nation turned against him, the interpreter of his humanity, and the custodian of a family identity shaped by triumph and tragedy. Through her, the Nixon story becomes not merely political history, but a deeply personal saga of loyalty under pressure, of family resilience, and of a daughter who refused to let her father's worst chapter define his entire life. The story of Richard Nixon often unfolds in the language of power. Primaries won, enemies made, tapes recorded, scandals detonated. It is the story of a man who climbed higher than most and fell harder than any president before him. Yet when seen through the lives of his two daughters, the narrative softens, deepens, and becomes unmistakably human. It becomes the story of a family caught inside the gravitational pull of a political life that consumed everything around it. Tricia Nixon Cox represents the quiet resilience behind the public storms. She learned to navigate scrutiny with grace, becoming the daughter who endured rather than confronted, who sheltered her mother during the psychological collapse of the Nixon presidency, and who later chose a life of deliberate privacy. Through her, we see the toll of public life, the way some children survive catastrophe by stepping away from the noise that once defined them. Julie Nixon Eisenhower stands at the opposite pole, articulate, unwavering, and fiercely loyal. She became her father's most visible defender during Watergate, shouldering responsibilities far heavier than any young woman should have to bear. In her, we see the daughter who met scandal head-on, who believed in her father's humanity even as the world dissected his flaws, and who spent decades insisting that the story of Richard Nixon is more complicated, more tragic, and more worthy of understanding than the headlines suggest. Together, the Nixon daughters illuminate the private cost of public downfall. They show how a presidency's collapse reverberates through a household, how children absorb the emotional shock that history books overlook, and how the burden of legacy can shape a lifetime. Their lives reveal that political tragedy is never just political. It is familial, personal, and carried forward by those who did not choose the spotlight, but were born into it. In the end, the full story of Richard Nixon is not complete without Tricia and Julie. Through their endurance and their contradictions, silence and speech, retreat and engagement, they restore the humanity to a man often remembered only for his worst hour. They show that even in the rubble of scandal, loyalty and love persist, and that the legacy of a president is never shaped by him alone, but by the children who continue the story long after the cameras have turned away.